Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Donna Savigny, President of the Board of Education, and I'd like to welcome you to our work session this afternoon for the fiscal year 2022 operating budget. Sorry for the delay in getting started. We were having, my PC was not cooperating, so I apologize for that delay. But without delay, we'll launch right into it. So Dr. Locker, why don't I hand it over to you?
Thank you, President Savigny. Board members, each year at this time, we have an initial budget work session to have preliminary overview and discussion of next year's fiscal year's budget planning process. Typically, we would forecast revenue estimates and discuss some priorities we may have in mind for the next year. As with everything else, this year is not very typical. COVID-19 has impacted much of our ability to have the kind of work session that we usually would as it relates to preliminary overviews. For tonight, the best we can do is discuss some ranges of scenarios and consider some unknown or outstanding factors. I'd mentioned that we would typically discuss some priorities. It's important to note, while we may not be considering priorities how we have in the past, we did a lot of work as we tied things to our strategic plan prior to the pandemic. That strategic plan still exists. It's still important to us. There's still a lot of work to be done. And certainly, as we must not lose sight of the importance of funding for our system as we think about not only those things that we aspire to in our strategic plan and have laid as goals for ourselves, but also the significant learning recovery efforts that will be happening over the next several to many years. So funding and priorities remain very important to us. Our operating budget is driven by student enrollment, and we have seen a decline in our enrollment related to the pandemic. This is true across the entire state, with some projecting a statewide decline in enrollment over 30,000 students. Again, statewide, over 30,000 students. This impact has ramifications, especially at the state level, where the formula is based on total students and students in different categories. We have heard much discussion at the state level and from legislators about the possibility of a statewide hold harmless provision for FY22, and certainly that'll factor into our planning process. For tonight, Mr. Hartlove is going to present a broad overview of some possible funding scenarios, both at the state and county levels. We'll also address some of the other factors or variables that we must consider as we work on a budget with you in January and February. And finally, Chris will conclude with a reminder of the timeline for our budget development process. Before asking Mr. Hartlove to present, I did want to remark on, just as we all know and lament how disappointing all this is, it was just last year the overall budget picture looked a lot different. We were seeing a flattening of our enrollment, if not the beginning of gradual increases back to the system, which also help us with state revenue. At the local level, in a partnership with our county commissioners, we had developed a 5-year funding plan that called for consistent, steady increases in local revenue for Carroll County Public Schools over the next 5 years. Our focus had shifted to the important work of defining our budgetary priorities in concert with our strategic plan to make improvements for our students, families, and employees. Important work, like I said at the beginning, it still needs to be a focus for us moving forward. Obviously, the pandemic has shifted much of that, but we'll hope that this is more of a speed bump in the road and not a large pothole. And so while it's extremely disappointing and challenging, what the pandemic has done, I know that somehow as a system and a community will work together, work through these challenges, and move forward again. So with that, I'll ask Mr. Hartlove to take us through the presentation. We can answer questions as we go and certainly have time at the end for questions as well. So Chris.
Thank you, Dr. Lockard. Good evening, board members. Since we're running opposite of the football game, I'll try to make it as short as possible. I feel like this is exciting material, and I'm sure the ratings for the Ravens-Steelers game just dropped off a bit. This is just incredible stuff. So we're looking at the fiscal year 2022 operating budget. Fiscal year 2022 begins July 1st of 2021 and ends June 30th of 2022. So we'll dive right in and start talking about revenue, state revenue in particular. So as the superintendent said in his opening remarks, state revenue is very much driven by enrollment. It's a fairly complicated equation, a formula, but the biggest driver is enrollment. And unfortunately, we are down enrollment right now. We're down approximately 770 FTE from last year from a funding perspective. So all of the enrollment factors that they use in this formula are down. That's the special education enrollment, free and reduced meals, English language learners, and disabled transportation enrollments are all down. So that's how we come to our estimate of a worst case of a loss of revenue of $4.1 million less than the current fiscal year. We believe that is a worst case. Now, the decline in enrollment, we believe, is different than previous declines. The decline we were in the last decade was a trend. We, conversely with this, we don't believe this is a trend. We believe this is an anomaly. As the superintendent said, a speed bump along the way. But the bad thing about this is if this were to hold, as we believe next fall, when the pandemic is in our rearview mirror, the enrollments will be bouncing back. We would, at the same time, we would be losing revenue. Now, in the past, a decade ago, when this was happening, we could reduce some expenses in alignment with that enrollment going down. We would not be able to do that in this case, so that would really put us in a bind. And our choices would be, things like larger class sizes, less services for students, and those are the types of things we would be looking at. But as the superintendent said in his opening remarks, we are looking, the bad news is this worst case scenario. The good news, or the reason for hope, is that this is something that's happening statewide, and we have strong reason to believe that there will be a hold harmless. We don't know exactly what that hold harmless will mean for us, but we hope that it means that we're closer to flat funding versus being down $4 million. We don't know if we would be down slightly, up slightly. We'd be somewhere in that kind of flat range, which is not ideal, but it is certainly better than a $4 million reduction. And it's something that we could work with, versus a $4 million reduction would be very difficult to work with. A couple of other points on this slide. It is right now, this estimate, we have no guidance from the state. This is an estimate that we did here in the office. It assumes no state inflationary factor. If the state does fund an inflationary factor, that's something that could help us by giving us more revenue. It also assumes no change in the per pupil relative wealth ranking. That's also something that could potentially help us or hurt us. The state formula is wealth adjusted. So as the wealthier you become on a per pupil basis, the less the state helps you. If you become less wealthy, then the state helps you more. So they come in and try to kind of balance things out a bit. So that's where we sit with state funding. I don't know if Mr. O'Neill wants to say anything about any more about the hold harmless before I move on.
And Chris, I actually have a couple of quick questions for you,
Sure,
if that's
sure.
okay. So obviously this is a different year than any other we've experienced, but from a historical perspective, how often has the state funded the inflationary factor?
Well, recently they have been funding the inflationary factor regularly. When we were in the middle of the right after the Great Recession, the 2008 2009 period, they did not fund the inflation factor for several years in that time frame. They held it flat. So we don't have any indication one way or the other right now, but we will know the governor's budget is released on January 20th, so we will know at that point in time. We may know sooner if we're fortunate, but we're going to know by then whether we will be getting an inflation factor or not.
Okay. And from a state hold harmless perspective, I know when we had the hold harmless provisions in the prior couple of years, that was because there were, 3 or 4 jurisdictions that had declining enrollment, and we were one of them. But now, is every county virtually in the same exact position that we find ourselves in?
I saw that the data I saw yesterday was that the state is looking at a potential 33,000 student decline. And I'm pretty sure that hits every jurisdiction. Not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that hits certainly a large number of the jurisdictions.
Okay. And like you said, that it's not a trend, it's a step change because of the current situation. So,
right. We don't have a crystal ball, but we do believe, I talked to Mr. Prokop and Mr. Kane regarding the enrollment projections. And right now, that's going to be, difficult, but there's no reason to believe that this is a trend. This is, it's a global pandemic, and there's a lot of people out there making different decisions, and to try to draw anything out of that other than it's a global pandemic, I think is all you can really draw out of that. There's those students still exist. They're just right now making other decisions. When we're back into more normal operations, we believe that a good number of those students will come back, and we were projecting enrollment increases over the coming years. So, once we get back to more of a normal operations and hopefully a more normal economy, that will all help to get us back on the right track.
and that was actually going to be my next question. Was we were projecting a slight uptick for this year, and it wasn't a significant number, but it was maybe a couple hundred.
I don't have it in front of me, but I believe we the last couple of years we've been flat or slightly up, and I believe that was going to continue in this upcoming year.
Okay. But the net is actually that we're down 770, not from our original projection, but down 770 from last year.
Correct. Okay. It's pretty. It's 3%. It's very significant. It's the biggest driving factor for. And again, the kind of the strange thing about this is the way the state formula works is you're funded in the upcoming year based upon the enrollment in the current year. So in most years that doesn't matter because your trends are going to be fairly consistent. If you're going up, you're going to be going up by a comparable amount each year. So we would be, if this kind of held and there was no hold harmless, as I said earlier, we would be funded for this lower enrollment amount when that enrollment would be bouncing back at that same very time. So it would really be, things going in the wrong direction. The drivers of expenses, number of students would be going up at the same time that revenue would be going down, which would be very problematic for us without a hold harmless.
Okay. Mr. Kyler, did you?
Yeah, kind of follow up with her, 2 questions, and I'll just ask them both, and you guys decide who. Because this is statewide, but of course the state's hurting, so they'd love to save all this money out of education. It's not like somebody else is getting the money we would have gotten, which is what's happening in the past. Do we expect much help? And kind of along with that, I think other years, maybe even in December, didn't the State Department of Education start doing some predictions? Have they said anything, or do you think the first glimmer of hope is going to be what the governor does in his budget, maybe?
We typically do get some preliminary numbers, and I know, I believe there are several organizations trying to put preliminary information together. So there's a possibility that we may get some early numbers. But those numbers would not be with the hold harmless. I think they would be without the hold harmless. So the hold harmless, I think, is really where we're kind of placing our hope. And I think I don't know if Mr. Neal wants to jump in here. I think he's had more conversations and has more insight on the hold harmless than I do. I don't know that he has a lot of information, but I think, we don't know a lot about what is being proposed or if anything's being proposed at this point, but we're looking at it as some form of being flat is kind of our best case scenario.
Yeah, correct, Chris. I guess all I could add is you never know anything for certain until the General Assembly opens and things start to move. But every indication we've had, and I think Dr. Lockhart would echo this through his contact with the Superintendents Association, have been through conversations with legislative leadership, committee chairs, and even different departments in the State Department of Education as they're looking ahead, seems to be that there'll be some details to be worked out both for FY22 and then what that means for any year beyond, but that we wouldn't be off course to expect kind of a global statewide hold harmless for FY22 for all the categories that Chris was referencing that make up the overall funding formula.
And do we have any feel for, do we have data on the 770 students? Do we know where they went? Did we lose them to homeschooling? Did we lose them to private schools? Do we have a reason for that? I mean, other than just saying, well, we hope that they're going to come back and we think that they might come back, I'd like for us to begin kind of collecting as much data to understand that situation better.
I have seen data, President Savigny, and I do not have it in front of me at the moment. I might be able to pull it up later by the end of this presentation. So I'm hesitant to give an exact number, but a large number of the students that we would have expected, in other words, the 770 or so head count that Chris is referring to, were students that we were expecting who are now either being homeschooled or in a private or were enrolled in a private school. And I can't remember. I'd have to spend a minute or two trying to remember where exactly I had that report from, or I hate to put Mr. Streaker on the spot, but if he has a more proximate number in mind, he could feel free to jump in with that as well. And I guess I'd say, unless Dr. Lockhart or Carl want to join in, beyond that, it's a little bit speculative because I don't believe we do, or that we're even allowed to sort of have too much conversation with parents about their choice. They certainly have their right to the choice, but this is all sudden and unexpected, and it marries up precisely to the school year opening with the pandemic. So these are numbers that are not typical at all, meaning the number of students who became homeschooled or enrolled in private school at that percentage rate is very anomalous or very atypical for us. And so I think Chris is accurate to say that there's no other plausible explanation for this other than it's pandemic related. But why any individual family may have made that choice, it would be sort of speculative to try to delve into their thinking as to whether, they made the choice because of factor A or factor B or factor C.
Mr. O'Neill, I can add a few things, maybe some clarity to that, although I don't have hard numbers. But there is a correlation between the volume of our homeschool numbers going up and our loss of enrollment. Those are definitely in sync. But to your earlier point, Mr. O'Neill, we're not able to ask. I would say anecdotally, much of the information that we has been shared with us by our families is indeed that they're, based on their the current situation, they're choosing to homeschool, but they've indicated intent to return when we return to traditional school, which we all desire so greatly right now. So at the end of the day, like Mr. O'Neill said, we're not allowed to formally ask, and that is one of the provisions in the homeschool. It's illegal for us to ask those questions. We can't mandate to know why someone's leaving. But most families, or many families, I would say, offer that and just have shared. So anecdotally, I can say there's a high correlation between those students that are exiting CCPS and going to homeschool, that we would expect many of them to return.
But can I ask a distinction on that? Is we're not allowed to ask, or we're just not allowed to require them to respond? I mean, we can't require them to respond, but we're not even allowed to ask?
Well, there's certainly with the challenge with that, President Savini, is that there we want to maintain a great relationship with our homeschool families, and there are some specific advocacy groups that feel like that even us asking would be an infringement on that. So no, we're not asking them, and it's not on any of our forms. We follow the guidance from the law, which is very restrictive on information that folks are required to give us for homeschooling. So we don't ask those questions. I would say, again, particularly in these circumstances, many families are sharing why they're leaving, mainly that they're not really why they're leaving, but that they are leaving because of the pandemic and, plan to return when school gets back to normal or typical would be what we usually hear.
Do private schools typically ask for a transcript, or is there any way to kind of get a count from that, or don't they always do it, or sometimes the parents do it themselves?
We do have transcript, like we have students transferring to private school, but to be honest, we've looked at this, and again with the anecdotal pieces. The other thing, again, I don't have hard numbers on it, but Mr. Kyler, one of the other pieces that's interesting, some of our homeschool enrollment has gone up. We have students that are coming from private schools to homeschool as well. So, we have CCPS students going to private schools. I think we have the most of our migration has been to homeschooling. But we also have students enrolling in homeschooling from private schools. There's just a lot of moving parts right now, and I think, understandably, given present circumstances, why people are making different decisions.
Yeah, and piggybacking on what Mr. O'Neill said, I remember seeing those same numbers, and it is homeschooling in private schools. Most, if I remember correctly, is homeschooling. It seemed like many more were homeschooled than were private schooled, but there was an increase in private as well.
And the reason why I'm trying to understand that is because of the hold harmless. If there is a hold harmless for FY21, great, and I think there's probably a pretty good chance of it because of the current situation. But I believe there was a 3-year roll-off of the prior hold harmless. So I'm trying to understand, like, what are the lingering effects of that going to potentially be, and how do we try to address that? How do we try to understand what is the risk of the students who have exited the public school system? What is our possibility or capability of getting them back? If we understand why they left, maybe we can try to figure out some risk mitigation of trying to get them back if the hold harmless is really just a 1-year thing.
Well, that's a great observation. So the hold harmless at the state level evolved over time. It did eventually become part of state law as a 3-year rolling average, which you just referenced, with the passage of the first Kerwin bill, the phase-in 3-year bill a couple of sessions ago. And so that, I think when I said earlier in general that the state, we have a lot of assurances that there'll be a kind of a global hold harmless for FY22, and then there's some details to work out, that the General Assembly will have to work through. One of those important details is what then do you do with the September 30, 2020 enrollment relative to the 3-year provision in the law? Is it a hold harmless just for FY22, or does that year sort of get taken out of the equation for the 3-year rolling average if that's needed to be applied in the future? So I think those are the kind of details they'll have to work out, and we'll just have to see how that unfolds, and then along with others, testify accordingly as it goes. So I guess what I'm saying there is the General Assembly is aware that they need to figure that out. At the same time that they would enact a hold harmless, they also need to figure out what about the year after that, and the year after that, and the next year. As far as getting those students back, I did locate the report that I had in mind, and the number's almost identical when you add up the unanticipated number of students who went to homeschooling after June 30 and the number who went to private school after June 30. It's very, very approximate, and that's a head count, but it's very, very approximate to the FTE, the adjusted FTE number that Chris was using that we expect to see the state use for our funding. So as far as getting them back, and maybe Mr. Streeter might want to clarify anything I say here. We do know where all of these students are. Any student in Carroll County, whether they're in our public schools or in homeschooling or in a private school, we're aware of where they are. We should be. We're required to be. So it's not, it's not that once they're gone, that's kind of the end of our contact. We're able to remain in contact as a school system, and we just, I don't. Yeah, Carl, you might want to chime in. I don't know what to say more about that at this moment, other than we do believe that the sudden shift has to do with the pandemic, and that we would expect those students to return once school and as a whole becomes normal again, or more normal again.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we can move on. I just wanted to try to understand, like, we know that they're gone, and we know that they're gone because of the pandemic. What the risk is that they stay gone, and if we can get a little bit more data about why they left, we might be able to make some plans to try to get them back. Rather than just making the assumption and crossing our fingers saying we hope they come back, right? Like if we understand why they left. Yes, Ms. Herbert.
I do believe that in talking to parents, I think we lost students to the private schools because they're open, a lot of them are open 5 days a week, and parents wanted that. Homeschooling, I can think that they didn't want the hybrid virtual, and they just wanted to do homeschooling. I know I have a girl at the barn that they said she was in Frederick County, and they said they just went to homeschooling until it's all over. So, but I think that's why we've lost them to the private schools, definitely.
Dr. Dorsey?
And I was just going to add, it's been my experience that usually the parents didn't have a problem with sharing why they were pulling their kids out, whether it was for homeschooling or private schooling. Not to say that, we could or couldn't ask, they just didn't make it an issue. They shared right up front, they won't be here next week or tomorrow because of, and that was it.
Right. Okay. Ms.
Well,
Paglia?
there aren't any more questions on state, and we certainly can come back to this if
Oh, it looks like, Mr. Hartlove, it looks like we have one more question from Ms. Battaglia.
Sure.
So real quick, I do have 3 questions. First one is there any specific grades that we saw students leave from? What is the current teacher-student ratio now? And could COVID money potentially help offset some of this?
Well, I can go right to the last part, that the COVID money is one time. So to the extent that we have costs, that are driven by the pandemic that are one time, certainly the dollars that we get from the federal government can, that's what they're perfect for. If it's beyond that, if it's something for a more of an ongoing, they're not going to be as helpful. So, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but if our enrollment rebounds like we believe it will, then it really will be a speed bump, as the superintendent said in his opening remarks, and the one-time money will help us get over the speed bump, and then we will be to the other side of this. Can you repeat your other? I'm sorry, I rambled on there and I forgot your first 2 questions.
The first one was, are there specific grades that we saw students leave from? And what is the current teacher-student ratio?
If I can jump in, Chris, I can jump in on at least another one of these. We can get that information. We don't have it in front of us here organized for you this evening, but certainly I can work with Carl and Student Services and Ms. McCabe, and we can put together information for, what grades across our system, what were the numbers in terms of folks leaving. As it relates to the current class sizes, that's a little bit tricky, depending on, who's opting for what right now. So I'm afraid, and we talked about, we weren't going to do the class size report this year, because whatever it is this year, we know it's probably going to be very different next year. And it was also kind of tricky to do based on the facts. I'm not exactly sure how helpful that might be for a decision about next year. But the other piece, we certainly can get that to the board.
Okay.
Good.
I think that this is probably going to come into play as we set our priorities and as some of these numbers start to get solidified of how do we balance the budget request. Ms. Eisenberg?
Yes, regarding home instruction for students, you are not precluded from asking
Okay.
the reason why. You just can't require anyone to answer you.
Okay. Okay. And so would we be able to ask them any kind of question? Like, so we might know why they left, but are we able to ask them what would make them come back?
You can ask what you want, whatever you want.
Okay.
It's just, am I on the mic? Am I on now? Yes, you're not, I'll repeat then, you are not precluded from asking why somebody is withdrawing their child for home instruction, but you cannot require a parent to respond to you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Okay.
And just add in there that, one of the things that Mr. Streaker and I have been working on and working with is developing and keeping good relationships with our parent advocacy groups in our community. And so, we know legally we're allowed to ask that question. That's been something that we've been very sensitive to. We've had agreements with some of our parent groups that we would be very sensitive to that. So we can certainly move forward and try to glean that information. We'll want to do it in a way that is sensitive to the parents making those choices.
Okay, with that, I'll move on to the next slide. So the other main source of revenue for us is county revenue. In fact, it's a larger portion of our revenue than state revenue. So we don't, this is another area where we don't have a lot of guidance. We do have the plan. The county each year passes along with their budget, they pass a plan for the next 5 years. So I'll talk a little bit about just the recent history, because that could be maybe indicative or helpful in us determining what may happen in 22. So if we look at the current year, FY21, the planned increase for that year was 3.13%, and that equated to $6.1 million. As we all remember, the pandemic, hit in the March timeframe. Everything, as the superintendent was talking about in his opening remarks, we were kind of moving along nicely. Then March hit, and I think the commissioners, I can't speak for them, but I believe they were trying to be proactive, anticipating potential revenue hits because of the pandemic and a potential recession. So they've reduced their dollars to us down, and we ended up getting an increase of 1.2 million or 0.59%. We were, that was helpful to get us to balance the budget. So that's kind of the recent history. And then we can talk about what's in the current plan. In the current plan for FY22, we're looking at another 3.13% increase, which equates to $6.2 million. So that's what's in the plan. We assume that that we may not get that amount because we may get some amount less than that because of the pandemic. But that's kind of the information that we have at this time. The other thing that could be helpful here is potential maintenance of effort legislation that would help counties in FY23. For those counties that want to help their school districts and give them dollars to offset state losses and to try to help the school district move forward. The maintenance of effort law could be a reason for them to pause, because if the county gives us additional dollars and we have fewer students this year, the amount per student, which is what maintenance of effort is. Maintenance of effort basically says that counties are required to provide to the school system at least the amount on a per student basis that they provided in the prior year. So that won't be a problem for FY22, but for FY23, if the county were to give us additional dollars, that would be divided by that smaller number of students, and it would increase the amount per student that they would be locked into for FY23. So certainly the state could help us by having legislation that helped us out didn't hold counties to that FY23 maintenance of effort, making it easier for them to give us additional dollars in FY22. So that's again that same theme of the enrollment coming into play there. So that's something else that we're hopeful for that will help us to have better negotiations with the county on the revenue amount there.
Okay, and that's something that we can advocate for and definitely talk with our delegates about for the next legislative session. I think that's very important. I also don't want to assume that we'll be at some amount less than the FY22 planned increase. I think we should wait to hear what the county picture looks like. Property values have actually increased during the pandemic. It's kind of an odd situation, but I'd like to understand what the county picture looks like and what their actuals have been and what their projections are looking like for the future. Because if they're not seeing a significant reduction in revenue, then I think we need to have those discussions with them of, try to get back to. We're going to have a lot of recovery learning to do. We're going to have a lot of tough situations to deal with over the next year. And so if the county revenue hasn't dropped, then I think we need to have a very open conversation with the commissioners, and maybe that can be one of our subject items for the January meeting that we're planning to have with them. And board members, any thoughts on that? Are we okay with having that be one of the items on the agenda for the January meeting? Okay. Thanks, Chris. I'm not seeing any other questions in the room, so go ahead.
Okay, I'll move forward. I mean, certainly that is, out of every number in our budget, whether it be an expense or a revenue, the biggest number is the county revenue. So any dollars that they can provide to us certainly are welcome and helpful to our situation. So we'll talk about some other factors, and the biggest on the expense side, other than salary issues, are inflationary impacts. And as we all deal with in our personal lives, the cost of items over time tends to increase. We deal with those same pressures here at the school system. The big items that we're talking about here are medical insurance, utilities for all the buildings that we have, and fuel for our buses. Those things tend to go up over time. We put in here a possible range. I looked at the last few years, and we were as low as 1.5 million and as high as 3.5 million. The budget office will be working over the next month, kind of focusing in on what those amounts actually are. You'll see the first real estimates for this upcoming year's inflationary impacts when the superintendent's budget is released at the January meeting. So that's out there to deal with. The next few items are all items we've already talked about, but they're unknowns. The hold harmless is an unknown, the revenue inflation factor, and the per pupil relative wealth ranking. Certainly something that we haven't talked about and we can't speak to too much is results of negotiations with bargaining groups. They haven't begun yet. But that's certainly something that will be happening during this process. As Ms. Battaglia referred to earlier, the additional federal stimulus, certainly we're hopeful that something will happen on that end, and it's less helpful to our ongoing operations, but certainly with the costs related to the pandemic and a lot of the recovery learning types of things that we're talking about certainly could be covered. At least the initial expenses that we would have towards those items could certainly be we could certainly utilize federal stimulus dollars for those items. So it could be very helpful to us. And finally, I'm just speaking for myself here. I'm optimistic that we're closer to the end of the pandemic than to the beginning, but it's still an unknown. And even when I don't see it as being a switch that we're just out of it. I think it's going to be kind of a slowly we move out of it. So knowing what the ultimate costs are going to be for us related to the pandemic are certainly still an unknown. So with that, we'll talk about next steps. Certainly had the work session today. As I said, the next formal step in the process is the superintendent's proposed budget will be released at the January meeting. We'll try to do our best to have much more refined estimates at that point. But as you guys all know, budget is an iterative process. So each iteration of the budget, we try to get more accurate and more refined numbers. Certainly, the governor's budget will be telling. We'll see what's going on there. There's a possibility he could have something hold harmless in his budget, which would be very helpful because it would let us know right up front what's going on. Certainly, we'd also find out about the inflation factor by January 20th as well. So that's something that can be very helpful for us for knowing what's going on, for having information. And then the next formal step for the Board of Education is to actually adopt a request to the county commissioners, and that would happen at the February board meeting. Of course, there's other steps here, but these are the steps that get us up to our request. The final steps happen in the April-May timeframe, where ultimately we are balancing our expenditures to what our final revenue numbers are. So with that, the presentation is complete, and we open up the floor for questions and your discussion.
Okay, so board members, additional questions for Chris?
Thank you. Good job.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think we asked most of our questions along the way. I think one of the key things for next steps, though, that I want to keep in mind is the meeting that we're planning to have with the commissioners in early January. I know we're working towards trying to get a date on the calendar. I think that this needs to be one of the main topics of discussion. I know, we had a joint meeting with them back in May, and that's when we had discussed the maintenance of effort situation, and there was so much uncertainty surrounding the pandemic at that point in time, and we had graciously accepted maintenance of effort because we knew that's really all that was going to happen, right? And we had talked about getting back together in September to revisit that, and that meeting didn't happen because of so many other things going on. But I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. We'd really like to understand what the county revenue picture is looking like and what their projections are looking like. Because if they are still on par with pre-pandemic projections, then, I'd like to see the commissioners honor the commitment that we made with them in the 5-year plan. Because we've been saying that, maintenance of effort over an extended period of time will be very difficult to run the school system on. So I just want to set that stage and make sure that we have very open and robust conversations with the commissioners in January.
Certainly, maintenance of effort in the current environment would be devastating to us. With 770 loss, that would be.
Yep.
Right.
Thank you.
It would absolutely be devastating.
Yes. Okay, Chris. Appreciate your time.
Thanks very much, Mr. Hartlove.
Thank you all.
Can I just ask one other follow-up question real quickly with, and this is probably for Mr. O'Neill, in terms of the MOE legislation, right, for providing relief from local governments from taking the, taking FY22 out of any calculations of MOE going forward, so, like kind of a forgiveness, I guess. When does that need to be addressed? Is that legislation that we would have to request the delegates to put in right at the very beginning of the legislative session? Like, what is the timing on that?
Well, it certainly could be pre-filed, or it could be something that arises at any point before the bill filing deadlines. For now, what we've done is Dr. Lockett and I had a meeting not too long ago with Mr. Zaleski and Ms. Wyndham at the county, and we talked about many different things, but one of them was the fact that while all of our legislative lobbies, so to speak, were focused on the state hold harmless, that it might be interesting to see where MACO, or the Maryland Association of County Governments, were relative to this kind of a hold harmless on local funding. So I think that's probably a conversation that's happening among MACO affiliates. Also, just before the just before we went for the Thanksgiving break, Mr. Hartlove and I had reached out to Mr. Woolhams at MABE just to inquire if he had any insight. And certainly he's well connected and much more in tune with legislative leadership. If he had any insight that we wouldn't have as to what level that's a thought already among legislators. So I guess what I'm saying is we were waiting for a little bit of feedback first, and then seeing where and in what ways we could help. But if it doesn't appear that there's a bill arising in any other way, then we could certainly reach out to the District 5 delegation and talk to them about filing something.
Okay. Thanks, John.
And Mr. O'Neill, like, I was looking, MABE doesn't have another legislative meeting until, I think, December 14th, but that doesn't mean, like you mentioned, you guys are pretty constantly reaching out to them, because he does have some great connections. And of course, hopefully, every other county has this situation this year, so we're all on the same side fighting for this.
Correct. Yeah, and we're going to follow up actively. So I'd already talked to Ms. Wyndham and Mr. Zaleski again recently. I don't remember when it was, but within days, and we put it on our radar to get back together. And I'll follow up with John Woolhams and see what insight he has now that we're back this week, and we'll bring that information to you, even if it's informally before your next meeting, or I guess you meet again on the 9th, and we can get a sense for how to approach it. But, back to President Savigny's first question, there's not urgency to it. It's not something you need to decide at your December 9th board meeting, as a deadline by any means. It's something that we can sort out in the opening weeks of the session.
And my last question on this. Typically, right around now, maybe a week or two later, we would probably have a meeting with the delegation. Now, with everything that's going on, is that something that we still ought to do, or is it just too cumbersome the way things are going this year?
I think we definitely have some things that we could talk with them about. I think a lot of us have been actually talking with them on a fairly regular basis, just to get the lay of the land from the state perspective. I think it makes sense to try to put a meeting on the books. That's typically in October, I believe, that we have that one, and it just didn't happen this year because of the situation.
October, yeah.
But even if we ended up doing that virtually, like if we were all in the room and they were virtual, or if we did 50-50 or something like that, I think that would be a worthwhile discussion to have.
We could certainly work to set something up that works with everybody's schedules, and could do that virtually.
Is everyone on board with that? If we try for January?
Early, yep.
Okay. Dr. Dorsey?
I was just going to comment that I know MABE is certainly going to be advocating for the hold harmless, because at the Board of Directors meeting this morning, it was certainly one of the items that was discussed. And I know John Woolams, and I think it's Mrs. Yoho from Frederick County who's going to be leading your legislative committee this year. They're certainly in tune, because as you're saying, there certainly is a need throughout the state as far as advocating for the hold harmless. Systems are certainly losing students. So
Right.
just wanted to share that that's certainly in the works for one of the things we will be emphasizing and advocating for.
Okay, good to know. Okay. Any other questions? And if not, I will thank everyone again for the presentation and the discussion, and we will log out of this meeting and move over into the board updates meeting. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you again shortly.